Hello, my name is Ana Maria Ossa and I'm a senior from Colombia studying math and finance. I am really interested in studying emerging markets and I am particularly interested in Latin American emerging markets. As a Colombian, I see potential for high growth and economic development in my country, and I am interested in studying the economic mechanisms that will determine its growth in the future. I also want to learn more about how the Latin American region as a whole is becoming more financially developed, and I want to study the effects of market integration in the growth of the region. This year, I've been studying emerging markets mostly through a financial lens. In particular, I am in the process of writing my thesis, which will be about equity market movements in emerging economies in Latin America. In this video, I will be talking to you about my research and the significance of this project. Equity market movements in emerging economies in Latin America. I will begin the discussion of this project by first defining some key terms and explaining the background of my research. I will then discuss in detail my research question and hypothesis. I will continue by describing the methodology and data that I've been using throughout the project, and lastly, I will explain the significance and the potential impact of this research. I will first define what I mean by emerging economies. Emerging economies are rapidly growing countries that are generally adopting a free market economy. In general, they promise huge potential for growth, but also pose significant risk, such as monetary and political. For the purposes of my research, I decided that the countries that I would categorize as emerging markets would be those in the Morgan Stanley Capital International MSCI Emerging Markets Index. The reason for choosing the countries in this index is that MSCI classifies countries as emerging markets not by their growth per se, but by their level of access to foreign investors, which is what I'm actually interested in. Other terms I want to define include equity market movements, which are the correlated or similar movements of equity markets in two or more economies, market liberalization, which is the lessening of government regulations and restrictions in an economy, market integration, or the free flow of capital across national borders, and lastly, financial contagion, which is when a shock in a particular economy spreads out and affects other countries. Now, why am I particularly interested in emerging equity markets? In the past few years, there has been increased investment in emerging economies. There are two main reasons that explain the increased interest. First, there has been high growth in emerging countries, driven mainly by population growth and productivity improvements. Second, emerging market equities provide investors with a source of diversification, as it allows them to have a non-dollar exposure. Moreover, as can be seen in the graph, the MSCI Emerging Markets Index has been overperforming the world index in the past few years, which shows why many investors might find emerging equity markets to be potential attractive investments. This is extremely relevant, as increased investment in emerging economies may further contribute to the country's growth and their economic development. However, at the same time, it has been found that equity market correlations amongst emerging economies are also increasing. In the last decade, cross-country correlations both within and between emerging market regions have increased notably. The potential reasons include first, market liberalizations and the lift of capital controls. Second, equity market integration, which as previously mentioned, allows the free flow of capital across regions or countries. And third, financial crisis, when financial contagion occurs and a shock in one economy affects others. This increased correlations can make investments in Latin America less attractive, as investors are looking to diversify their portfolios and thus want equities in them to have low correlations. Based on those facts, my research question is twofold. First, are movements in Latin American emerging equity markets significantly lower than movements in other emerging market regions? Second, what are the main economic mechanisms that drive this difference? Some research has shown that in Latin America, the movements of equity markets occur at a lower degree than in other regions. However, this fact seems to be disputed. Therefore, I am interested in learning whether this is actually the case. Based on my current research, my hypothesis is that Latin American market movements are in fact lower than in other regions. Moreover, my hypothesis is that the economic mechanisms that account for this difference are lower market integration and economic growth compared to other emerging market regions. The first method I considered using was to measure cross-country correlations within regions by using the method proposed in the research conducted by Ailing and Gerard. Here, returns in a country I in a region A are driven by a local or regional factor and a world factor, and the return of each country has some exposure to both local and world returns. Therefore, the total variance of a country's return can be decomposed into systematic variance due to a world factor, systematic variance due to a regional factor, and country-specific residual variance. However, this method has a few limitations. Here, we need to make the assumption that all economies in any region have the same exposure to global and local factors. Moreover, in this proposed setup, the correlations between any pair of countries within a specific region are equal. Therefore, I have decided to use a second method, in which cross-country correlations are measured using multivariable regressions. Here, returns of a country I in a region A have exposure to the returns of other countries in that region. Moreover, I have decided to use linear regressions to determine the correlation between the returns of each country and the macroeconomic variables that I am measuring: trade openness, market liberalization, equity market openness, financial market development, industry mix, economic growth, business cycle, corruption, and political risk. The data I have been using comes mainly from 3 databases. First, country-specific stock return data comes from the Emerging Market Information System (EMIS) database. Second, returns for global and regional indices come from the MSCI database. And third, data for economic variables such as equity market openness come from the Standard & Poor's Emerging Markets database. Lastly, I want to discuss why the results of this research are so important. If it is shown that correlations have decreased in Latin America, even though it may be attractive for investors to invest in Latin American stocks, it may be the case that correlations are low because there is low market integration and high capital controls that prevent investors from investing in these stocks. However, if it is shown that there are increased correlations in Latin America and then they have been mainly driven by market integration, there may be 2 opposing effects. First, since it is easy to invest abroad, investors may feel encouraged to buy stocks in Latin America. However, investors may now not see these as attractive as they are not diversifying their portfolio anymore. Therefore, this research opens up a new debate on whether increased or decreased correlations affect international investors positively or negatively. On a similar vein, the results of this research open up a debate on the effect of increased or decreased correlations in the overall economies of Latin American countries. If there is higher market integration and there are increased correlations, there is improved access to Latin Americans' equity market, but there may be lower demand of Latin American equities. On the other hand, if there are decreased correlations but lower market integration, there may be more demand for Latin American equities but limited access to them. The question then becomes, which effect is more pronounced and will have a higher impact in the economy? I am still in the process of analyzing data, but I believe that the results of this research project will be novel and will bring really interesting questions to the research field of emerging markets in finance. I look forward to sharing my results and findings with you in the near future.